Okay, so you've got your camera and you can take pictures, but one of the key things we want to ask in this class is what makes a good photo. So let's start by talking about exposure. What is exposure? Exposure is the amount of light that your camera records. So a good exposure captures this Goldilocks moment that's just the right amount of light. And it takes some learning to get to do. Your camera will tell you what it thinks the right amount of light is, and sometimes that works, and sometimes it doesn't. To get the right amount of light in your photograph, you need to start with a good amount of light illuminating the subject you're photographing. Generally, the more light, the better. So if you're in a dark room and there's not good light and the light doesn't fall on the subject matter you're photographing, you're probably not going to get a good exposure. So let's say you have the right amount of light. The next thing is adjusting your camera so that the camera can record the light that is there. So there's different ways this happens. Some of it is determined by your camera, so different cameras have different capabilities. So if you notice, the DSLR has a much bigger lens than the iPhone. So this bigger lens can let in more light and gives you a lot more flexibility for taking pictures. But then some of it is also controlled by you and how you use your camera. So we'll look at a few quick ways to do that this week. And then in week 5, we'll really dive into aperture and shutter speed and manual controls and how you are actually setting the exposure on your camera. So things that you want to avoid are an overexposed picture. So if a picture is overexposed, it means there's too much light. So what this looks like is it's just a really bright photograph. It just feels too bright. And one thing that often happens is you get areas where there's just pure white. These are called blowouts because you can't fix a blowout with editing. If an area is gray or light green or another light color, you can kind of make it darker or make it brighter. But if it's pure white, it's going to stay pure white. So you want to be careful about avoiding pure white in your photographs. Also, you'll just find when you get those blowouts, you can't see the details. You can't see what's interesting. The opposite of an overexposed photo is an underexposed photo, where there's not enough light, so the photo itself feels too dark. There's areas of pure black, so it's not a white blowout, but rather a black blowout. And again, you can't see any of those details just because it's too dark. And then sometimes you can get a photo that does both. It's too bright and too dark because there's too much contrast. So you'll notice that there's areas of pure white and areas of pure black, and you still can't see details in either of those areas. This often happens when you're shooting into a light source, directly into the light source. So you get these strong contrasts and you get this sense of silhouette. There are a few situations where this can be nice, but as you're beginning photography and as you're learning some of these things, try not to shoot into a light source. Put the light source behind you instead, and you'll get a really nice illumination of your subject as opposed to this stark contrast that kind of hides all the details. You can't see what's going on. So, what is a good exposure? A good exposure is just right. The subject feels illuminated really well. You can see all the details, the textures. There's lights and darks, but it's not pure white or pure black, so there's no blowouts. How do you get a good exposure? Well, the first step is to find or make good lighting. If you don't have studio lights, the best thing that you can do is go outside as opposed to inside. Even outside on a cloudy day or a rainy day has better light than inside lights. The sun is just a strong light and it makes for good photographs. If you're inside, getting closer to the sunlight, getting closer to a window can be good, or moving a bunch of lights around can be helpful. You can think through the time of day. If you're outside at night, you're not going to have as much light as if you're outside in the middle of the day or just after the sunrise or just before the sunset. You're going to have different amounts of light at different times of day and different qualities of light. But again, we'll talk about that a little bit later. Think through the angle of the light. How is the light hitting the subject? Does it make interesting shadows or does it make annoying shadows? And if you move yourself and move the subject, will that make for better lighting? And then if you have the capability, move the light itself or move the object that you're taking a photograph of to be closer to the light, to be farther away from the light, to receive the light at a different angle. So good exposure starts with good lighting. Then, if you're using your camera, one of the things you can do to adjust the exposure is to adjust the exposure compensation. So we'll look at that, how to do that in both the DSLR and your iPhone, or your Android phone, whichever phone you have. And then in week 5, we'll talk about how you use manual settings to set the exposure on your camera. So that's exposure. Another thing that's really important to making a good photo is focus. So focus is the relative clarity of a photo. It's basically the opposite of blur. So usually good photos have the subject in clear focus. Sometimes photos intentionally blur part of the photo, usually not the subject, as a way to highlight the subject. So you can see on the bottom right photograph, the leaves are in focus, but the background is intentionally blurred so that we can see the leaves better. But the focus on the leaves is crisp. The leaves themselves don't feel blurry. I can see all those details really nicely. Other times, the whole photo is in focus. So the photo on the left, the landscape is the subject, right? So you don't want any part of it blurry. And if you look at even those mountains in the back, you can see the details of the waterfall and the snow on the rocks. You can see the trees going into the background. The whole photo is in crisp focus. So what can make bad focus? There's 2 different things that can make for bad focus. One of them is called camera shake, and this comes from motion blur. So motion blur is something that happens when something is moving so fast, your camera sort of captures the pattern of the movement. And this usually happens when the lighting is lower, and basically the camera needs to stay open longer, and so it captures that movement. Camera shake, so if something's moving, that's motion blur. Camera shake is actually what happens when the camera records the movement of you holding the camera. So if you're holding the camera and you kind of shake the camera a little bit or even move just a little bit, and this is really, really natural when you're holding a camera and taking a picture because you click on that button. But if the camera, if it's a low light scenario and the shutter's staying open longer, basically you record that whole movement and everything in the photo ends up looking blurry. So you can see on that photo that everything kind of has that sense of like shake or blur. So how do you avoid camera shake? One of the things is, I'm going to just repeat this a lot in this class, but get good lighting. If you have better lighting, you can take a faster photo and you're less likely to get motion blur. Another thing you can do is increase your shutter speed. So this happens naturally when you have better lighting. Or if neither of those are possible, use a tripod. So the tripod will hold the camera steady and you don't have to worry about the shake that happens from you holding the camera. The other possibility for bad focus is incorrect focal distance. So basically, just like your eyes, when you look around, you focus at different distances. If you look at something closer to you, you focus closer. If you look at something farther away, you focus on that. And if something is too close to your eyes, it's blurry, right? Like you can't focus on it if it's too close to your eyes. So when you have your camera, you're telling your camera, okay, what distance do I want to set the focus at? And if you're not setting the focus at the distance that your subject is at, the camera's going to focus on something else, or rather, basically a different distance, and your subject is going to appear blurry. So if you look at that picture on the bottom right, like obviously this is meant to be a portrait of that person, but the person is blurry and that car in the distance is nice and crisp and clear. But we don't really care about that car. We care about the person. We want them to be in focus. So we're going to look at ways to set your focus. If you have a DSLR or another camera that has that shutter release button, if you hold it down halfway on your subject, so aim at your subject, hold it down halfway, it's going to set the focus, and then you can move your camera a little bit to readjust the composition that you're taking. If you're using a phone, you just tap that square to set the focus on your subject. And again, if you have a DSLR, usually have the option to use manual focus, that focus ring on the lens. If you're comfortable with that, great, use it. If you've never used it before, you're welcome to play around with it, but take a few pictures using autofocus where you hold that shutter release button down halfway as a way to double check that you have a solid focus on your camera, because it can be hard to learn how to use manual focus. Okay, let's talk about camera modes and how you can gain even a little bit more control over how you're taking a picture. So there's a lot of different things that affect how your camera records an image, but some of those things are the amount of light, the distance of the subject matter, so we talked about focus, but then also the motion of the subject matter can really affect how your camera takes a picture. So when you're taking a picture, you're setting what mode you want the camera to take that picture on. And the different modes are basically a balance between you saying, here's how much I want the camera to control, and here's how much I want to control. So the automatic camera modes give the camera a lot more control. The manual camera modes give you a lot more control, but you kind of have to understand how they work. So this week we're going to dive into some of the automatic modes and how they can be helpful to you. And then in week 5, we'll dive into some of the manual controls and how you can take a little more control over your pictures. So there's, when you look at your camera dials, you can see the dial over there on the right. There's always the auto option. And basically the auto option, the camera chooses everything for you. In the other automatic camera modes, so these are the ones that have the little icons associated with them. The camera's still making all the choices, but you're telling the camera, here's the kind of scenario that we're in. And basically you're judging how much light is there, how far away from my subject matter am I, what's the distance, and what's the motion. Is the subject in motion or is the subject still? So the camera is going to choose settings based on that information. Your textbook this week goes into detail on some of these automatic camera modes, but let's do a brief overview. So generally the one where you have that picture of a person's head is called portrait mode. So if you think about taking a portrait, you're relatively close to a person, but not super close. The lighting's probably pretty good, and everyone's probably fairly still, right? Like there's not a lot of motion. So distance is maybe like 3 to 6 feet. Light is good. Motion is still. So the camera's adjusting for those things. For sports mode, the key thing here that you're telling the camera is something's going to be in motion. It's going to be moving fast. Sometimes you'll see a kids and pets mode option. Again, you're telling the camera something's moving quickly. I want you to capture this quicker. Landscape mode, you're telling the camera, okay, things are at a distance. I want there to be a lot of focus from near to far, because there's the things that I'm taking a picture of are far away and I still want them to be in focus. Macro mode is the exact opposite of that. You're basically saying things are super close, like inches close to my camera, and I really want to focus on the details of those things that are super close and make the small things big. And then your camera's going to adjust for that. Night mode or night portrait mode, you're telling your camera, okay, there's not a lot of light. So it's going to slow down and let in more light so that you can see some of the details of what's going on at night. Now, with each of these, none of them are perfect. But if you think through, like, okay, what's the light, the distance, and the motion, you can apply them to a variety of settings. For example, if you're shooting down the street, you may not think of it as a landscape, but you're shooting into the distance, so landscape mode will be helpful. If you're taking a picture of a still life and you're about 3 feet away from it, you're not necessarily taking a picture of a portrait, but the light, the distance, and the motion are still the same as a portrait, so portrait mode can be helpful. So understand how the different modes work. In your textbook, he talks about how the camera compensates, and that can be helpful to understand too. And these can be really nice if you're just taking pictures quickly and you're like, oh, I need to do something quickly. Thing is moving. Okay, I'm going to go straight into sports mode and just take some pictures. And you have a lot less basically dialing in of all the camera settings. Some cameras go into all sorts of crazy settings. So you can see in that picture on the right, you've got sunrise mode, sunset mode, beach mode, snow mode, party mode. You've got spring mode, fall mode, and sometimes they get a little bit ridiculous. So I'm more worried about the main automatic modes. Try them out. See how they change a picture, how they affect a picture. And then the more that you know how they work, the more you'll be able to apply them to different scenarios successfully. So one of the frustrations of these automatic camera modes is the camera does take control. You're telling the camera the certain situation, but it takes control. So you have no control over forced flash. If the camera decides it needs to flash, it's going to flash. And that can be really frustrating. You also have no control over white balance or in your DSLR, that exposure compensation that I was telling you about, you can't adjust that in the automatic camera modes. So what's a solution? I was showing this in the DSLR. I really like the P mode. P stands for programmed auto, and it's basically a fully automatic mode, but you can choose to shut off flash. You can also choose to adjust your exposure compensation, and you can set the white balance. We'll be diving into white balance on week 4. So that's a lighting thing, but it's nice to be able to set that. So